Welcome to 360 Man podcast designed to help you follow Jesus in every area of your life. Hello there, my name is Nathan Rouse, lead pastor at Faith Church, and I also help the National Men's Ministry team by hosting the podcast, trying to help equip men around the world. It's so good to have you here with me, whether you're folding laundry, whether you're on your commute, mowing the grass, whatever you're doing. I'm glad you're hanging out with me today. Listen, I want to start out with a question before we drop into the meat of today's episode. Who do you have in your life that you've invited in your life for accountability? You know, we are, of course, saved individually, but we're kept and grown in community. We need one another. And maybe you've, at some point, have fallen onto the side of the road of life, and you've been trying to walk out your salvation and your Christianity as a solo act. Can I just remind you and encourage you, you need a church family. You need a group of men that you can be encouraged by and strengthened by, that you've invited into your life. You've given spiritual and emotional permission to speak into your life. And hopefully you have an opportunity to speak into theirs, be an encouragement and challenge in their life as well. But we cannot be doing this life alone. You can't just be listening to these podcasts alone. You need some other men in your life that you have intentionally set aside time for to be connecting and growing in the Lord. Be a part of a local church. There is no plan B to reaching the world. God wants to use the church to make disciples of all nations. Man, I hope you'll put some roots down somewhere and start building those relationships. Well, listen, in today's episode, you're going to hear the first part of a two-part series, and it's a story of tragedy and God's healing power after a devastating loss. In 1988, what's been called the Carrollton bus crash claimed the lives of 27 people, and it continues to be the worst drunk driving accident in American history. And to tell the story, we have someone that didn't just hear about it. We have someone that was actually on the bus when the crash occurred. And my guest with me is Dr. Alan Tennison. He serves as the theological counsel to the General Council of the Assemblies of God, and he chairs its Commission on Doctrines and Practices. But today, he's simply a brother in Christ sharing his story of God's redemption in the midst of just a ton of loss and God's help in the midst of so much pain. So without further ado, let's drop into this first part of our two-part series with Dr. Alan Tennison. Let's do it. Dr. Tennison, thank you so much for your time and hanging out with us today on the 360 Man podcast.
Oh, Nathan, it's a pleasure to be here.
Yeah, it's great. Dr. Tennison, you've had a massive impact on our fellowship, and I know you would not be the person to say that, but I just want to recognize that. But in all your help with walking alongside our fellowship in the area of doctrinal purity and guidance. In our fellowship, I would love to go a different tact with you today. I would love to talk to you about a vehicle accident that you were a part of at a young age, and this will be familiar maybe to some in our fellowship that maybe have been around a long time. But I would love to take us back to 1988 because I think there's going to be a gift here, not only of testimony of God's help in the midst of a really painful situation, but also I believe there's going to be a gift for maybe men that are listening that are walking through some tragedy or pain in their own life as we walk through this today. But can we just set the scene? It was 1988, if I get that right. Take us back to 1988. Set the scene of where you were at in life, what life looked like for you and your family before this whole thing took place.
Absolutely. So my mom and dad were pastors of a Assembly of God church in Radcliffe, Kentucky, which was the inner city. Radcliffe is the inner city of Fort Knox. Okay. And so it was a church that had only had, I think, two pastors, or maybe a founder and then a pastor when my dad came in. And it was probably a congregation of about 80 people. Mm-hmm. Well, from the time that he started till about 10 years later, that church had grown from about 80 to 800. Wow. Mostly military families. So it's about 75% military families. And through that time, the church had grown, but the youth group had really not grown. You know, we were back in the old days where every youth pastor was a volunteer from the church.
Right. It wasn't yet an occupation.
Wasn't an occupation. Yeah. And so we had some wonderful youth pastors, but they were all people who were working in the community and just kind of managing the youth group. So the youth wasn't actually growing alongside the church in the same way. Yeah. So what had happened was within the last year, we had hired a new youth pastor who was actually the vice president of our local bank. who just had a burden for youth ministry, was clearly gifted for it. And in 1 year, our youth group had grown from about 20 kids to now about 60 or 70 kids.
Yeah, wow.
And it was just because of this incredible youth pastor who had come in with this love for kids and just an incredible guy. So we every year would take an annual trip to Kings Island, which was the closest amusement park to us at the time. So it's about a 3-hour drive from Radcliffe to Cincinnati. This year, he said to us, you can invite your friends, whatever. And that morning, we had more people show up than we actually had room in our church bus.
Okay.
And so we had a church bus, which was an ordinary school bus we had bought, I think, a year before from one of the school systems, 22 rows on the bus. And you could fit 3 kids to a row, so that's 66, plus the bus driver, that's 67.
Wow.
And we cut it off at that, right? Like you can only, and so others had to follow in a car. But I mean, it was packed.
Yeah.
And so it was fun. We had 4 adults go with us in the bus, our bus driver, who was our associate pastor, of course, our youth pastor, and then we had a youth choir director who brought a friend of hers that didn't go to the church, but just to hang out with us today. And so everyone piled into the bus, drove there, had a phenomenal time at the amusement park.
Yeah. And you can imagine the fun. Right, the energy is on the bus. It's huge. It's packed.
It was amazing, and it was a large youth group, middle school, high school mostly, but there were even some younger kids there because their siblings were going, and so they were going with them, to kind of be there as a family. So had a wonderful day. Now, while we were out, having our fun, there was a factory worker in Kentucky by the name of Larry who had just gotten off work for the weekend. And he went to a bar with some friends. And one thing to know about Larry, apparently he had also recently lost a lot of weight. And his drinking was no longer matching his weight, if you know what I mean.
Gotcha.
Like he was still drinking as a much larger guy. Went to a bar with some friends.
And was having a higher impact on him probably.
Yeah. Then went to a friend's house and got some more to drink. And at the end of the evening for him, he actually was intoxicated enough that his friends took his truck keys away from him.
Okay.
And just said, no, we can't let you drive home. And he convinced them that he only lived about maybe a mile from where he was and said, look, I will be home so quickly, just give me my keys, I can make it. And so they gave him his keys. He got on the interstate to just, I think, maybe take the next exit. He was apparently close to his house. But rather than getting on the right side of the interstate, he got on the wrong side of the interstate.
Man.
Driving at high speeds. And that's when we met him, coming from the right side of the road. We had left, Kings Island at a time that it was Saturday, and we wanted to be sure that we got back in time so parents could pick up their kids because there would be church the next morning. So we're driving down. We're in Carrollton County, which is on Interstate 71. We meet him right headlight to right headlight, and where it was around this bend where there was a small mountain or hill, so that our bus driver, our associate pastor, or the state police later said, probably couldn't have seen his headlights until right before impact.
Wow, because it was coming around the turn.
Because it's coming around the turn just when we hit right headlight to right headlight. It punctures the suspension. It breaks the suspension system on the bus. That punctures the gas tank. Now you have metal hitting the pavement. It ignites the gas. The gas tank explodes. Fuel and fire start rushing underneath the bus. And because a bus is built in sections, the fire starts coming up through the sections, also catching the seats on fire.
So can I just stop you just for a second? So, Dr. Tennison.
Oh, and you can call me Alan.
Okay, Alan. What was the first inclination to you? And how old were you at the time?
15.
15. What was the first, where were you at on the bus? And what was your first inclination that something was wrong? Was just all of a sudden? What do you remember first?
I was sitting third from the back. I was sitting right on the edge of the seat, and I was asleep. In fact, most of the kids on the trip back, because you're late,
you've been tired.
They're out. So my head was actually into the cushion in front of me because I was just the right size that I could, be completely contained.
Okay.
And when the crash happened, it just kind of drove my head right into the cushion.
Right.
It wasn't, I remember waking up feeling something, but it wasn't abrupt for me.
Right.
But there was someone screaming behind me.
Wow.
And I just jump up and turn around. And as soon as I turn around, I'm facing an open emergency door, and there's a rush of bodies behind me, and I fall off the bus.
Wow.
And all I remember, and I had a cap on, and the cap was like right down to because I'd been asleep, right down to my eyebrows. I just remember these feet running. And I had the presence of mind to just follow the feet, right? I had no idea what was going on.
So the door had already been opened.
Yes.
You're turning, people are already headed out the back.
And I fall off the bus, and I just follow the feet.
Right.
And now when I fell, I twisted my leg, but I didn't really
You're basically
realize
running
that.
off the end of a bus.
Right.
Yeah,
right.
You're not looking to try to land
I just woke up. And in fact, I am assuming at this moment that I'm in a dream. There was a guy who had been seated behind me, a tall man. His name was also Larry. He was known for having such a large shoe size.
Okay.
So as I'm running, I suddenly see these shoes in front of me, and I immediately know it's Larry. And I look up, and he's bleeding because he had his head back, and when the crash happened, it threw his head forward and cut his chin. And so I see him bleeding, and I just look at him, and I just say, like, am I dreaming? Because I
said that out loud.
I said that out loud. Am I dreaming? Like, what's going on? Wow. And I just see him staring past me, and I turn around, and that's when I see the bus is fully in flames, and kids are still coming out of the back. Because this was a bus that had been built before the standards for multiple exits. In fact, this crash is one of the reasons why you have now these standards for multiple exits. So the impact had crushed the front door. The windows did not pop out on this style bus. Wow. And so you have everyone trying to get out of the exit in the very back. I was 15. I was one of the oldest people there because all the adults died on the bus except one, the visitor. And she had been small enough, she was actually able to get out the little window that opened up, but she passed out.
And all the adults were at the front of the bus.
Were at the front of the bus. And so I see people still coming out. And at that point, there had been a registered nurse who was driving by at the time of the crash who just happened to have a bunch of blankets in the back of her car. So she starts throwing blankets over kids and just putting them out in the median. Of course, everyone else is stopping. There are people who are rushing to the bus to pull people out, others who are running to check on the kids, but it's a chaotic situation. Now, at this time, I don't see any adults that I know, right? And I'm 15. I'm the pastor's kid. Yeah. And if you grow up as a pastor's kid, you always know there's this certain feeling of responsibility.
Now, your parents weren't on the trip.
No. My mom and dad, my grandfather had actually celebrated his birthday, and so they went that and gave me permission to still go on this trip because I didn't want to miss the youth group trip.
Right.
So first state trooper that arrived, I remember running up to him. Because what I'm thinking as the PK is I've got to get word to my dad. This is before cell phones, and I know my dad is at the church waiting for us to arrive. I know that there are going to be parents there waiting to pick up their kids, and I'm looking at the situation, and I'm like, I've got to get word to him as to what's going on. So I go up to the state trooper, and I still remember the state trooper is just staring at the bus, holding on to the car door. And I go to get his attention, and it's like he's looking, past me.
Like he's locked in.
He's just locked in, and immediately there's an EMT that arrives, and this guy just like kicks into gear, and he starts ordering people. Okay, you here, he just like goes into the mode, right, of service mode. And he looks at me, and I just say to him, very quickly, sir, my name is Tennison. I'm the son of the pastor. I just tell him who we are, blah, blah, blah. I just give all this. And he okay, I've got it, thanks. Yeah. And, he goes on. So I go back to talk to my friends. I'm helping some people get into an ambulance or get into, they unloaded a whole nother bus that didn't have as many in it. It wasn't with us, but with some other group, just so they could load those of us who were less injured in there. And so I say all of this because that's going to play out in a minute. What happens to us is they take us to 5 different hospitals. They even at one point, of course, they have to airlift for some of the injuries. And so they actually have semis that apparently use their lights to create a temporary landing pad. But they use ambulances from 5 different hospitals. I was on one of a bus that they were going to transport, but they went in to see if anyone was injured. Right. And I just casually mentioned then, my leg feels weird. Yeah. And so an EMT immediately tries to roll up my pants leg, and it had swollen so much that he couldn't roll it up. Wow. And I, and so suddenly he said, he pulled out this big scissors, and my first thought was he's going to cut my leg. And I'm like, really, I'm fine. Yeah. He just cut he felt, said, might be broken. He said, do you want to ride to an ambulance? And I'm like, he said, do you need help? And I was fine getting on the bus. As soon as he told me it might be broken, I'm like, oh yeah, I definitely need help. So they helped me get on an ambulance filled with 5 kids. And they rushed us to one of the hospitals.
Let's just stop you just for 1 second, Alan. What was the extent of the injuries you saw? Of course, you saw the friend, one of the adults that had a cut chin. Did you see any other injuries?
Oh, absolutely. I saw kids who were burned. I had one girl come up to me because, there's a lot going on. One girl come up to me and she's covered in smoke. And she just says, she comes up to me. She's like, we just need to pray. We need to pray. And she reaches out for me and I'm afraid to touch her because I'm like, you look like you're burned all over your body. She wasn't, but it was that moment of, adults rushing around trying to get kids to settle down. We need everyone to get in their place.
I had 67 people on board.
67 on board. The injuries were still being counted.
Right. So you get rushed on a bus. Others are being life flighted. Others are on other vehicles, ambulances, various things. What happens when you get to the hospital?
When I get there, they x-ray me because they thought, it wasn't broken, just sprained. Then they released me to the cafeteria where they had released other kids. Now, at this moment, one of the parents walks in, who was the first kid off the bus was Conrad. His dad was a sergeant at the base in Fort Knox. He'd called his dad. He's the first one to the hospital. Called his dad. His dad drove like a madman to get there for his kid. And so his mom comes in, and I'm sitting there, and his mom puts her arms around me, and I don't know how she knew this, but she immediately starts to cry and says, John's gone, who was our bus driver. And as the first moment that it hit me, I didn't see everyone. There's been such chaos, but I hadn't really, as this 15-year-old put together, well, some people might have not made it off. Yeah. And I remember sitting there in the cafeteria
because
looking at the people who were there.
Up, you had no idea.
And it was just chaotic.
Right.
And sitting there and thinking, because she's crying, John's gone. And I'm just thinking, who else have I not seen? And I'm running through my youth group. Did I see them there? Because there were some kids that were covered in blankets, not dead, just covered. But I'm like, did I see them? Did I see this person? Did I see that person? And there's just kind of this growing sense of horror that this isn't just an accident. This is something that's more than that. So then what Sergeant Garcia did was he took as many of us as the hospital would release in his van to drive us back to church. Well, this is Saturday night. So now we get back and it's Sunday morning.
And you still have not spoken to your parents yet?
No. Well, no, because, there's just chaotic. We get to the parking lot. And as soon as we get there, Sunday morning, I see our parking lot filled with news vans. And, even including national news vans. And that's when it just starts to really hit me. Oh, no. This is
catastrophe.
Huge. Yeah. So let's go back now to my mom and dad. My dad is at the church waiting for the bus to arrive. No one is there. They've missed the thing. Parents are there. He's not sure what's going on. Finally, he gets a call from Sergeant Garcia, who basically says to him, Pastor, our bus has been in a head-on collision. They're rushing our kids to multiple hospitals. My son's at one of them. I'm going to pick him up right now. Bye. And that's all my dad has. And so immediately he starts calling. He starts calling hospitals, not getting any word. He calls the board in, says, every board member, I need you at the church right now. Calls my mom. My mom's there. And this always gets me choked up because part of this is the grace of God, right? My mom's first words are, what about our son? Is Alan okay? It's like, I don't know, but I know I need you here. So they get there. The first person that my dad's able to get a hold of is the very state trooper that I talked to that night. And the first thing the state trooper says to him is this, Pastor, before I tell you anything, I need you to know, Don Allen Tennison, your son was standing next to me tonight, and he is okay. That's the first thing my dad hears. And my mom said you could see as he's on the phone, his whole face just changes.
Sure.
Because they're pastors, but they're parents first.
Yeah.
And at that moment, that piece of information gave them the freedom to be pastors. And they were able to just go into that mode.
Rather than the constant worry of you.
Constant worry, because they're like, he's okay.
Yeah.
Now we can focus.
Take care of the sheep.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So they let people know what was going on. The state trooper basically says, we need a list of all the kids who, everyone who was there. And he says, well, it's on the bus. Talk to our youth pastor. And the state trooper's like, sir, your youth pastor's gone. The bus is burnt. It takes a while to get what people are telling you.
Right, processing.
We said, we'll talk to John, our associate pastor. I'm sorry, he's also one of the fatalities. He said, Pastor, there's been multiple fatalities. So, my parents have this crisis. The bus comes, or the van comes back to the church that morning. As soon as it opens up, there's my mom at the van door. Wraps her arms around me, crying, and then boom, she's back in the church because she's got to take care of those parents. I walk into my dad's office, and when this happened, again, a lot of the members of our church are military. One of them immediately set up a command post in my dad's office with multiple phones going to, this is for the state police, these are for the hospitals, this is for someone, just my dad was stationed there,
right,
answering phones, managing. I walk in, and it was that moment of my dad saw me, shook my hand, went back to the phone, and later would tell me he didn't remember that at all.
He was just in pastor mode.
Just that focus of having to deal with this. So what happened was they pulled kids out, but they rushed them to so many different hospitals, they didn't take time to get everyone's name.
Like, this person's going to so-and-so.
Yeah, they didn't know. And so we had a list of, by the time that by the way, Sunday morning service is going to happen. There are parents who have been there all night at the altar praying for their child to return safely. My dad can't get out of the office because he's managing this crisis from his office. So my mom gets on stage and handles the worship, handles the sermon, while parents are still at the altar praying that God would spare their child.
That's going on the whole time.
And of course, as the town hears about it that morning, the whole town starts showing up. And so suddenly we have a packed out church of even people who don't attend because they want to know what's going on. The news, of course, is getting in everyone's face as they're trying to get in the building, because they're trying to get the story as it's breaking. And just God bless the military. One of the general at the time, General Tate, who was commanding officer at the base, shows up at our church that morning. He sees what the press are doing, and he says to one of the sergeants, call Major so-and-so and tell him to handle this press. Mm-hmm. And so the sergeant gets on the phone, and he's like, Major, if you have the time. So General goes, he has the time. Give me the phone and says, I need you down here in 20 minutes. 20 minutes, this guy comes into our parking lot, apparently in golf shorts, jumps out and puts all the press in, grabs, sawhorses, puts all the press in a certain section
like
of the parking lot, a barricade, and says, we will send people out to you to give you updates to whatever. You quit bothering the people who are coming into church. Quit putting microphones in their face. We will come to you. And so the military helped us out in a tremendous way by organizing. And again, so many of our church members, including those who had kids on the bus, were military.
Right.
That they're just whatever you need, we're here for you.
Yeah.
So we find out that most of the dead on the bus had actually fallen between the 8th and 10th rows. And we're not dead because of injuries from the crash, but from the smoke. And what it looked like, there was a wall of bodies as people were trying to get out, and this is where they had collapsed. We found our associate pastor. Our youth pastor had been standing in the stairwell when the crash happened, and so he had been pinned in, I think. Our associate pastor, who probably could have gotten out from the side window, had actually, you have the driver's window there, they found him with 2 10-year-old girls in his arms. And it looked like he had been trying to push the wall of bodies over, trying to get them out. But the bodies, of course, had melted together. And so they were trying to, and I'll just say this, within about, they say 4 minutes, it was 2,000 degrees inside the bus. The seats had caught on fire. People had also brought helium balloons with them from the amusement park. This is the 80s. A lot of people had hairspray on the bus. All of those things are going off with the heat. And so they initially thought it was something like 17, I think, bodies that were on the bus. So 17, 33 unaccounted for. And so you're looking at the list. I remember seeing the list of the 33 names of people I know that haven't been accounted for and being told 17 of them are dead. Well, which one? Then as they started picking bodies apart, the number changed. It went from like 17 to 21. then later on 21 to 24, and then finally the number stopped at 27. And as they, took the bus actually with the bodies to an armory, and when the coroner started working through this, they had to identify people by dental records. And then as news came, my parents had to call parents in one by one and let them know that it was your child that they have identified, and, this and that, and just to spend the rest of that Sunday as we started getting in word, telling parents, it's yours.
So in the end, how many dead?
27 dead. About 36 injured.
And they were able to track down the kids that had been in the various hospitals?
Okay. Yeah, figure out who was where. Yeah. And then, of course, about maybe 10 or 11 of them, it was severe burns that, was disfiguring. One amputation, but had survived. So everyone that was pulled off survived. All the fatalities were those that were not able. And, of course, there were people actually reaching into a 2,000-degree bus and pulling people out who, just weren't able to get out on their own. But everyone that was pulled out lived.
No words. So, Alan, you're 15. You're processing this. That had to shape you. And we can we'll go down the road in a little bit and talk more about what God taught you in it all. But stay at 15 just for a minute. How did that whole ordeal shape you at the time?
Well, for everyone, it was a nightmare. I think of it sometimes as a collective nightmare that everyone's experiencing from a different angle. So you have the nightmare of parents who are finding out that the child that they had let go for an amusement day. In fact, multiple stories of parents. One set of parents, their child was graduating from high school, and they actually bought him a car, drove it to the church that night. So when he would get off the bus, he would see his new car. He never came home. A 10-year-old who never came home. We had also widows who were made because of their spouses who had died, and widowers on the bus. The nightmare of being the pastor. My dad preached the funerals of 16 people in 48 hours, most of them children.
And that's not something they teach in Bible college.
That is not something, and to have to do that. And again, there was strength that came from people coming together. There was the nightmare of, and I have to mention this, even the bus driver, Larry, not the bus driver, the drunk driver, Larry, he doesn't remember the accident. According to his account, he went out drinking with some friends. He wakes up, handcuffed in a hospital and is told, you've killed 27 people. And that's its own special nightmare, right, that he's responsible for. But it's still a nightmare that he has to live. So I'm 15. And I'm living this nightmare of watching the funerals of my friends at a time when you feel immortal and you suddenly realize how much that's not true. And people that you were friends with for years, that this is your church, these are your classmates and people you had crushes on, and all of these people that are just gone. Watching as the pastor's kid, my mom and dad deal with this. My dad coming home at the end of every night late because he had gone from this meeting to the burn units to be with the parents, and just watching all of this take place and just realizing it wasn't something that you could wake up from. It wasn't something that a week later things are back to normal. It was this new reality that was also national news, so that everywhere you go in your town or your community, people also know who you are, and you're from that church, or they find out you're a survivor, and suddenly everyone's focused on you, and you're just kind of living this life of seeing people go through this, and it was like a nightmare that you get used to. Not something you wake up from.
Yeah, it wasn't just an incident.
No,
one moment, but an ongoing wound that had to be healed over time,
and an ongoing loss. You learn that grief is not something you necessarily get over; it's something you actually learn to live with. And I'm experiencing that at 15. not having lost a sibling or a spouse or just friends, whereas the people around me, you would see their grief in a way that was even more, felt more deeply than you could appreciate.
Man, I know it feels like a cliffhanger to stop it halfway through, but just for the sake of time, we're going to stop it there and pick it up back in this next month's episode. Man, the story is heartbreaking, but I want to remind you and encourage you that God showed himself faithful, and I want to make sure that you tune in to the next episode as you hear about what God did in the lives of the church, in the lives of the families that were affected by so much loss. And I want you to hear how God carried them in the midst of it. There were actually miracles on the back end of connection and provision that were miraculous. Maybe after you listen to that episode, maybe you're struck by a couple things. Maybe things don't seem so rough right now, or maybe it just highlights you're walking through your own valley of the shadow of death. You're walking through a lot of loss or devastation or your own tragedy. Man, we don't want you to walk alone. You're here. We're here for you. And I want to encourage you that you reach out to us. A way you can reach out and share your prayer needs is by emailing me at nathan@360manpodcast. That's nathan@360manpodcast.com. I'd love to hear your story, hear what is going on in your world, how we can come alongside you in prayer. I'd love it to share it with a few guys in the National Men's Ministry office that we can be holding you up and praying. You don't have to go through it alone, and we'd love to hear from you. That email address is also a great place for you to share maybe episode ideas that you have as topics that you want us to tackle. That would be a gift to you. I'd love to hear your ideas there. That helps kind of fuel direction of the podcast as well. Listen, that's it for this month's episode. If you feel like the podcast has been a help and an encouragement to you, would you share it? Would you like and subscribe wherever you're listening to the podcast, whatever platform you consume it on? And that helps the momentum and just the podcast to reach more guys. That's the heartbeat behind what we're doing here. Well, 360 Men, we love you. Remember, strength, courage, endurance.